Story begins. The morning Marta Voss found the grocery receipt in her mailbox, she was wearing her gardening gloves, the ones with the yellow sunflowers on the wrists. Her neighbor Ruth had given them to her 3 Christmases ago, wrapped in silver paper with a bow that was too big for the box. Marta had cried a little when she opened them, not because of the gloves, because of the card inside, which said, "To the best neighbor I've ever had. Don't let the roses boss you around." She was thinking about that card when she pulled the white envelope from the mailbox. No return address. Standard business size. Inside was a single slip of paper, a grocery store receipt, milk, eggs, bread, orange juice, laundry detergent, $14.62, nothing unusual, except that Marta had not been to that grocery store in 11 years. She stood at the end of her driveway for a long time. The Ohio morning was pale gray, the kind of gray that couldn't decide if it wanted to become sunlight or rain. Across the street, Ruth's tabby cat sat on the porch railing and watched her with the profound indifference of a creature that had never been asked to be anything it wasn't. Marta turned the receipt over. On the back, in ink so faint it was almost invisible, were 4 words printed in a typeface she had not seen in 31 years. Vanya is waking. 72 hours. She folded the receipt, placed it in the pocket of her gardening apron, walked back to her roses, knelt in the damp soil, and for 23 minutes she pruned dead blooms with the mechanical patience of someone who had learned long ago that the only way to survive extraordinary moments was to make them look ordinary. But her hands were shaking, just slightly, just enough that she nicked her thumb on a thorn she would have normally avoided. She watched a single bead of blood form on the pad of her thumb, and she thought, for the first time in years, in Russian. The town of Millhaven, Ohio, population 9,214, had a way of making people feel like they had always belonged there. The streets were wide and unhurried. The library had been in the same building since 1923, and the librarian, a woman named Doreen who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, knew the name of every family in town. The diner on Maple Street served the same pie recipe it had been serving since 1967, and the man who owned the hardware store on the corner had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his father before that. It was the kind of town where people noticed things, where a new car in a neighbor's driveway prompted friendly questions the next morning, where the arrival of strangers was noted and catalogued with the warm suspicion of a community that had decided long ago that it liked itself exactly as it was. Marta Voss had lived here for 31 years. She had arrived in the autumn of 1991, 2 months after the Soviet Union began its final, spectacular collapse. She was 26 years old. She drove a used Volvo. She had a teaching certificate from a university in Munich, a letter of recommendation from a church in Düsseldorf, and a social security card that was 3 years old and absolutely, completely, professionally fabricated. She had rented a small house on Elm Street. She had introduced herself to her neighbors with a slight German accent that softened over the years without ever fully disappearing. She had gotten a job at the elementary school teaching 3rd grade. She had bought the house 4 years later, when the rent became more than a mortgage payment, and in doing so had planted roses in the front garden that became, over time, something that people in Millhaven pointed out to visitors. The Voss roses, they called them. Best in the county. She had met Dale at a town hall meeting about sidewalk repairs in 1994. He was the municipal water department supervisor. He was kind. He laughed easily. He was exactly the kind of man that a woman trying to disappear into a community would choose, not out of calculation, but because calculation had become so deeply embedded in her nature that it had started to feel like instinct. She had not planned to love him. She was fairly certain she had managed it anyway. They married in 1996. Claire was born in 1998. And somewhere in the years between Claire's first steps and her first day of school, and her first heartbreak and her graduation from nursing school, something shifted inside Marta Voss that she had never been trained to anticipate and had no protocol for managing. She had become real, Not Natasha Belova, the girl from Leningrad, who had been recruited at 19 by a man in a grey coat outside the university library. Not Operative Nightingale, the designation assigned to her in 1989 during 6 months of intensive training at a facility outside Moscow that appeared on no official map. Not the asset described in sealed files in 3 different languages as patient, adaptable, exceptional under pressure, capable of sustained identity integration over long-term deployment. Just Marta. Marta, who grew roses and made good coffee and sat on Ruth's porch on summer evenings and talked about nothing important for hours at a time. Marta, who could identify a child's learning difficulty before the school psychologist and who always remembered the names of her students' pets. Marta, who cried at movies she had already seen because the second time she knew what was coming and cried for that reason, not surprise. She had become the thing she was pretending to be. And now Vanya was waking. The name Vanya was not a name. It was a designation, a code word embedded so deeply in her training that hearing it, or in this case reading it, produced a physiological response that 31 years of ordinary life had not erased. Her pulse elevated, her peripheral vision sharpened, her breathing reorganized itself without conscious instruction, slower and deeper, the pattern she had been taught to use in high-stress situations. The body remembered what the mind wanted to forget. She spent the first 24 hours doing nothing. This was intentional. The protocol she had memorized in 1989 was explicit. Upon receiving activation signal, maintain normal behavioral patterns for a minimum of 24 hours. Do not deviate from routine. Do not make unusual communications. Do not alter appearance or schedule. Be as completely as possible the person you have been pretending to be. On the first day, she taught her Tuesday yoga class at the community center. She had been teaching it for 9 years. There were 11 regulars, ranging from a 23-year-old who came for the Instagram content to an 81-year-old named Harold, who came because his doctor told him he needed to move more, and this was the least embarrassing option available. Marta moved through the poses with them, adjusting Harold's Warrior 2 and complementing the 23-year-old's crow pose and noticing, from the position of the sun through the high windows, that she had approximately 48 hours remaining. On the evening of the first day, Dale made pasta. He was not a particularly creative cook, but he was a consistent one, and his pasta sauce had the virtue of being exactly the same every time, which Marta had come to find comforting in a way she couldn't fully explain. They watched television. Dale fell asleep in the chair before the show ended. Marta watched him sleep for a while, the familiar architecture of his face, the small scar on his chin from a childhood bicycle accident, the way his left hand rested on his knee with the fingers slightly curled. She thought, I have been sleeping beside this man for 25 years. I know exactly how he breathes at 3 in the morning. I know that he talks in his sleep when he's anxious, and that he always says the same thing, which is, check the gauge, which refers to something from his early career that he has never fully explained. I know that he is afraid of spiders and embarrassed by this fear, and that he has killed exactly 0 spiders in this house in 25 years because I always handle it before he notices. I know that he loves me with the uncomplicated sincerity of a man who has never had reason to doubt that the person he married is who she said she was. She turned off the television, went upstairs, did not sleep. On the second day, the second envelope arrived. This one contained no receipt, just a phone number written on a piece of paper in the same faint ink. Below the number, a single additional word. Packet. Package. Marta burned both pieces of paper in the kitchen sink, ran the water, and washed the ash down the drain. Then she stood at the window above the sink and looked out at her garden, and tried to remember the last time she had thought about what it would feel like when this moment came. She had thought about it often in the early years. The first year she had barely slept. Every unfamiliar car on the street was a surveillance vehicle. Every stranger at the grocery store was a federal agent. Every conversation with a neighbor felt like an interrogation she was somehow failing. She had been trained for this, prepared for exactly this kind of sustained alertness. But training and reality are different animals, and the reality of Millhaven, Ohio, was that nobody was watching her, nobody cared about her. And the most dangerous thing that happened in a given week was that the pastor's dog got into Ruth's garden. She had relaxed, gradually and then completely, the way you relax into warm water. By the 5th year, she had stopped waiting. By the 10th, she had almost stopped remembering. By the 20th, Natasha Belova had become something that happened to someone else, a character in a story she had read once, a photograph in an album she no longer opened. But the body remembered. And now the phone number was in her hand, and the protocol said she had 24 hours left, and somewhere, in a place she could not see or locate, a mechanism that had been dormant for 3 decades had begun to move again. She did not call the number. Instead, she called her daughter. Claire answered on the 2nd ring. She was between shifts, she said. She was tired. She was happy. She had news, actually, good news, something she had been waiting to tell in person, but couldn't wait anymore. She was engaged. His name was Michael Reardon. He was 29 years old. He had been Claire's boyfriend for 3 years, and Marta liked him with the careful, measured warmth of a woman who has learned not to fully trust her own instincts about people. He was thoughtful and patient, and made Claire laugh in a way that reached her eyes. He had brought Marta flowers on her birthday, which nobody had asked him to do. He had fixed Dale's kitchen faucet without being asked, and then pretended not to notice when Dale teared up slightly, because Dale was a man who was moved by small acts of competence and always embarrassed by his own emotion. Marta said all the right things. She was thrilled. She was so happy. She loved Michael. They would celebrate soon, all together, dinner at the house. Yes, of course, whatever Claire wanted for the wedding. After she hung up, Marta sat at the kitchen table and placed her hands flat on the wood surface and pressed down hard, as if she were trying to anchor herself to something solid. Because she had just remembered something. Michael Reardon was not only Claire's fiancé. He was a federal analyst. He had started 6 months ago at the regional office in Columbus, 28 miles from Millhaven. He analyzed infrastructure security, water systems, power grids, municipal networks, the same systems that appeared in the package the protocol said she would be required to retrieve. Marta closed her eyes. This was not a coincidence. Nothing in this world, for people like her, was ever a coincidence. She had been 17 when she first met the man in the grey coat. His name, she later learned, was Dmitry Vasilyev, and he was the kind of person who existed in the spaces between official categories. Not quite military, not quite civilian, not quite anything that could be precisely named. He had come to the university library on a Tuesday afternoon in November, sat down at the table where Marta was working through a differential equations problem set, and asked her a question that had nothing to do with mathematics. He asked her what she thought freedom meant. It was 1982. She was 17 years old, and she was brilliant. And she had been raised by parents who believed absolutely in the system they lived in, not because they were naive, but because they were practical. And practical people in the Soviet Union of 1982 understood that belief was less a matter of conviction than survival. She had answered carefully, the way you answered everything carefully, aware that any room might contain ears you couldn't see. Vasilyev had smiled at her answer. He said she was very smart. He said smart people were rare. He said that smart people who could also be patient and adaptable and invisible were rarer still. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. They talked about mathematics and then about linguistics because Marta had a talent for languages that she had been told was exceptional. She spoke Russian, Ukrainian, and German. She was studying English. She absorbed accents the way other people absorbed weather, unconsciously, accurately, without effort. Vasilyev never asked her to do anything. For 3 months, he simply talked to her. And then, in February 1983, he told her about a program. A long-term program. A program for exceptional individuals who could disappear into another culture and wait and be ready and eventually serve their country in a way that no soldier or diplomat could. He told her the program would give her a life A real one, not a pretend one. She would live in America. She would have a job, a home, relationships. She would experience, in full, the society she was observing. The only difference between her life and an ordinary American life was that one day, at some unknown future point, she would be asked to do something specific, and she would be ready to do it. She had asked him what happened if she refused, when that day came. He had looked at her with the steady patience of a man who had answered this question many times. He said, "We hope you won't want to." She was 19 when she entered the training program. She was 24 when she deployed. She was 26 when she arrived in Millhaven, Ohio, driving a used Volvo with a fabricated identity and a skill set that included advanced surveillance techniques, dead-drop protocols, emergency exfiltration procedures, and the ability to clean and field strip 6 different types of firearms in under 3 minutes. She had never used any of it, until now. On the 3rd day, she called the number. She used a payphone. There were only 2 left in Millhaven, one outside the post office and one at the gas station on Route 9. She used the one at the gas station because the post office had a camera mounted above the entrance that covered the street, and the gas station camera pointed at the pumps and not the phone. She noticed she had assessed both locations before making the decision. The assessment was automatic, effortless, the way she once, long ago, assessed every room she entered. The body remembered. The phone rang twice. A voice answered, male, middle-aged, no accent she could identify. 7 days late, the voice said. I was being careful, Marta said. A pause. Your Russian is excellent. It should be. The package is in Columbus, a storage unit. I'll text the location to a number you'll recognize. Retrieval needs to happen before Friday. What's in the package? Another pause. Longer this time. Documentation. Digital files. Access keys for the Columbus Metropolitan Water Authority infrastructure system. Marta said nothing. You'll also need to extract certain materials from a contact, someone who recently acquired access to the system's vulnerability analysis. We believe this contact has been in your proximity. She was very still. Define proximity. Close personal association, someone you know well. She let the silence stretch out. In her training, she had been taught that silence was information, that the spaces between words told you as much as the words themselves. The voice on the phone was being careful about something, careful in a way that suggested it knew more than it was saying. The contact, Marta said. What's his name? We'd prefer you identify him through the documentation. What's his name? A beat. Reardon, Michael Reardon. Marta hung up. She stood at the payphone for a long time. The morning traffic moved past on Route 9. A pickup truck, a school bus, a woman jogging with a stroller. The world continuing its ordinary revolution around a fixed point that had suddenly, irrevocably shifted. She walked back to her car, sat in the driver's seat, did not drive. She thought about Claire on the phone 2 days ago, the brightness in her voice, the particular happiness of someone who has just made a decision they are entirely certain about. She thought about Michael, fixing Dale's kitchen faucet. She thought about the flowers he had brought on her birthday, which were irises, because he had remembered that she had mentioned once in passing that she preferred irises to roses despite growing them. She thought about the fact that someone, somewhere, had arranged for her daughter to fall in love with a federal analyst who had access to exactly the information they needed, or they had identified the analyst through his connection to her. She couldn't tell which was worse. What Marta did next was not in the protocol. She drove to Columbus, not to retrieve the package, not to identify the storage unit. She drove to a coffee shop on High Street where she had arranged to meet Claire for lunch 3 weeks ago, a plan that had been standing long before the receipt arrived in her mailbox. She sat across from her daughter and ordered a salad and listened to Claire talk about the engagement and the proposed venue and Michael's family, who were from Michigan and who she was slightly nervous about meeting, and whether a spring or autumn wedding made more practical sense given nursing schedules. Marta watched her daughter's face and thought, "You look exactly like your grandfather." Not Dale's father, who you've met, your other grandfather, the one who existed before I became someone else. He had the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking, the same quick movement of the hands when making a point, the same absolute confidence in the rightness of his own enthusiasm. You have no idea who I am. And the thought was not new. She had thought it 1,000 times, in 1,000 variations, across 26 years of motherhood. But today it arrived differently, weighted with something that felt very close to terror, because Claire was telling her now that Michael had been talking about his work. Not in detail, because there were things he couldn't share, but in general terms, just the scale of it, the importance of infrastructure security in an era of increasing cyber threats, the particular vulnerability of water treatment systems in mid-sized cities. He says it keeps him up at night sometimes, Claire said, and laughed softly. I told him he needs to separate work from home better. He's so dedicated, though, he cares so much, Marta said. He's a good man. Claire looked at her. You really like him? Yes. That means a lot, Mom. It really does. Marta drove home on Route 70, windows down despite the cold, and tried to locate within herself the person who had memorized dead-drop protocols and identity integration techniques and the most effective ways to extract information from an unwilling source. The person who had been trained, specifically and deliberately, to do exactly what was now being asked of her. She found her. She was still there. She had always been there. But so was Marta. And for the first time in 31 years, the two of them were at war. That night, Dale asked her if she was all right. She said yes. He nodded, accepted this, and went back to reading his book about the history of American waterways, which he had been reading for 4 months, and appeared to be enjoying with the slow satisfaction of a man who reads to understand rather than to finish. He had a yellow highlighter that he used to mark passages he wanted to remember. The book was heavily marked. Marta watched him from across the room and thought about all the things she did not know about her own life. She did not know, for instance, whether Dale had ever had suspicions, whether there had been moments, across 25 years of marriage, where something had flickered wrong, where a word she used or a reaction she had or a silence she kept had seemed somehow off-register. She had been very careful. But she was not perfect. No one was perfect for 31 years. She did not know whether the Soviet program she had been recruited for had survived the collapse. She had assumed over the years that it hadn't. The USSR dissolved in December 1991, 3 months after she arrived in Millhaven. She had watched it happen on American television, the images of statues falling and flags changing, and had felt something so complicated she had no name for it. Relief, perhaps. Loss. Certainty that the apparatus that had sent her here had ceased to exist. She had been wrong. She did not know who was running the apparatus now, whether it was Russian intelligence in its current form or a private organization that had inherited the old networks, or something else entirely. She did not know how many other people like her existed in communities like Millhaven, living lives like hers, waiting for receipts in their mailboxes. And she did not know, this was the question that had been turning in her mind since the payphone, whether Michael Reardon's presence in her daughter's life was a weapon aimed at her or a weapon aimed at him. She went to bed at 10, lay in the dark beside Dale's familiar breathing. The digital clock on the nightstand said 10:17, then 11:02, then 12:34, then 2:09. At 2:09 she made a decision. It was not the decision the protocol required. The FBI field office in Columbus had a public number. She called it from a different payphone, this one outside a 24-hour laundromat on the east side of Millhaven. It was 7:45 in the morning. The temperature was 38 degrees. She wore a hat pulled down over her ears and a coat she had bought at a garage sale 3 years ago because she had liked the color, and which she now appreciated for the additional reason that it looked like nothing in particular. She asked to speak with the Counterintelligence Division. The voice that answered was young and professionally neutral. She gave them a name, not her name. A name she had been given in 1989, a secondary designation for exactly this type of contact. A name that should, if the system worked as she had been told it worked, produce a specific and immediate response. It did. She was on hold for 4 minutes. Then a different voice came on, older, female, measured in a way that suggested experience rather than training. "This is Special Agent Hartwell. You said the designation was Nightingale 7? "Yes." "When was this designation assigned?" 1989. "The contact was Operative Control Vasilyev. The program was called Rook's Nest." A pause, long enough that Marta thought the connection had dropped. Then, "Where are you?" "I'd prefer to meet in person." "Give me a location." She named a diner. Not in Millhaven, not in Columbus. A midpoint town on Route 70, a place called Hendricks, where she had stopped for gas twice in 31 years and where nobody would recognize her. 2 hours, Hartwell said. "There's one more thing," Marta said. "Whatever you do in the next 48 hours, do not contact or surveil a man named Michael Reardon. Not yet." Another pause. "Why?" "Because he's engaged to my daughter." She hung up. The laundromat behind her hummed with the mechanical patience of machines performing their function. Through the window, she could see a man reading a newspaper while his clothes tumbled in a dryer. He did not look up. No one did. She walked to her car. The morning was very clear, very cold, and for a moment it looked so much like a morning in Leningrad that she had to stand completely still and breathe slowly through her nose until Ohio reasserted itself. The body remembered, but so did the heart. Special Agent Diana Hartwell was 52 years old and had been with the FBI's Counterintelligence Division for 23 years. She had the look of a person who had made a choice, early in her career, to find her satisfaction in precision rather than recognition, in problems solved rather than credit received. She was not tall. She wore a dark blazer and no jewelry except a watch that was functional rather than decorative. She arrived at the diner in Hendricks 7 minutes before the agreed time, which Marta noticed and which told her something useful about the kind of person she was dealing with. They sat in a booth in the back, ordered coffee, waited until the waitress moved away. "Nightingale 7, Hartwell said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." The program was called Rook's Nest, Soviet long-term penetration operation, late 1980s. We've known about it since 1997. She paused. "We identified 11 assets over the years. You're the 12th. Marta looked at her. "You were the one we couldn't find," Hartwell said. "The program records are incomplete. Some files were destroyed in 91. Others were sold to us by defectors, but the data was inconsistent. We had a partial list. You weren't on it." "How did you know about the designation?" "We didn't, completely. When you called and gave it, we ran it through the database. It matched a partial file from a 1998 defector brief. The file had a name, a photograph, and a single line of operational text." She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a grainy photograph, clearly reproduced from something much older. A young woman, early 20s, dark hair, standing in what appeared to be a corridor, looking slightly to the left of the camera. Marta looked at the photograph for a long time. The young woman looked back at her from across 31 years. "The operational text," Marta said. "Asset deployed Millhaven, Ohio, 1991. Designation Nightingale 7. Long-term dormant. Exceptional integration capability." "That's all?" "That's all we had." Hartwell folded her hands around her coffee cup. "For 27 years, we knew there was a sleeper in Millhaven and couldn't find you. We interviewed 24 residents over 6 years who fit the general profile. We never got close." "Who were you interviewing?" "Teachers, municipal employees, people with unexplained gaps in their documented histories." Hartwell paused. "Your documented history has no gaps. Your legend was very well constructed." "I know." "The woman it belongs to, the real Marta Voss, she died in 1989. Car accident in Bavaria. No close family, minimal official presence." "I know that too." They sat for a moment. The diner was filling up with the mid-morning coffee crowd, a table of retired men, a woman with a laptop, a pair of teenagers sharing a plate of fries despite the early hour. "Why now?" Hartwell asked. Marta told her about the receipt, the phone number, the storage unit in Columbus, the call she had made and what the voice had asked her to retrieve and from whom. Hartwell's expression did not change significantly, but something sharpened in her eyes. "Reardon." "Yes. He started 6 months ago. Columbus field office knows him. He's been doing infrastructure security analysis. Good work. Early reviews are strong." A pause. "How long has he been with your daughter?" 3 years. They met before he took the position. And the activation came when? 6 days ago. Hartwell thought about this. They could have identified him through her connection to you, rather than the reverse. If they've been monitoring Millhaven. That's what I think. Or they identified him independently through his work, and his connection to you was a bonus, a way to add pressure. Yes. Which is worse, from their perspective? Marta looked at her steadily. Neither. Both accomplish the same thing. They want the infrastructure access data, and they believe I'm the most effective way to get it. Whether I'm the primary lever or the secondary one is irrelevant. The result they want is the same. Hartwell studied her. "You've been thinking like an operative." "I was trained to. For 31 years. Yes. But you called us instead." Marta said nothing for a moment. Outside the window, Route 70 moved steadily past. A semi-truck, a minivan, a pickup with a dog riding in the back, ears flat against the wind. "I have a daughter," she said finally, "and she is going to marry a man who is a good person, and I am not going to be the instrument that puts him in danger." Hartwell nodded slowly. "What about yourself?" "That depends on what comes next." "What comes next," Hartwell said carefully, "is that we would very much like your help, if you're willing. The storage unit, the contact network, whoever made that call. We've been trying to map this operation for years. You're the first active asset we've ever had access to. You want me to go back?" "Not exactly. We want you to continue appearing to comply, while cooperating with us." Marta looked at her coffee. It had gone cold. "You're asking me to be a double agent. I'm asking you to help us protect your daughter's fiancé and close down a network that has been operating inside this country for 3 decades. And afterward? That's a conversation for after." Marta thought about the yellow sunflower gardening gloves, about Ruth's card, the bow that was too big, about Dale's pasta, and his mocked-up book about American waterways, and the way he said her name, with the slight emphasis on the first syllable that she had never heard him use with anyone else's name. About Claire at the coffee shop, tilting her head exactly like a grandfather she would never know she had. She thought about the young woman in the photograph, standing in a corridor, looking slightly away. She thought, that woman was real once, and she thought, this woman is real now. "Tell me what you need," she said. The next 72 hours were the most precisely constructed performance of Marta's life. She called the number, said she was ready, said she had encountered a complication but could manage it, said she needed 2 more days to establish access to Reardon through Claire, naturally, without raising suspicion. The voice on the phone agreed. This suggested they had reason to trust her timeline, which meant they were either watching her, monitoring calls, movements, behaviors, or they were confident that an asset dormant for 31 years would not suddenly develop loyalties that outweighed her training. They were wrong about the latter, and Marta was counting on them being wrong about the former too, because Hartwell's team had spent 48 hours establishing that the surveillance on Millhaven was technological, not physical. Passive monitoring of certain communication channels, digital tripwires, nothing that required eyes on the ground. She retrieved the package from the Columbus storage unit on a Wednesday afternoon, wearing a coat she had never worn before, and driving a rental car she had paid for in cash at a place 40 miles from Millhaven. The unit was registered under a name she didn't recognize. Inside was a waterproof bag containing a USB drive, a printed set of instructions, and a small device she recognized from her training as a signal extractor, the kind used to pull data passively from a phone placed near it. She handed everything to Hartwell's team within the hour. She called Michael Reardon the next morning and asked if he and Claire would come to dinner Friday night. He said yes immediately, with the uncomplicated warmth of a man who was genuinely fond of his future mother-in-law. She said she would make her mushroom risotto, which she knew he liked. He said he would bring wine. On Friday evening, Michael and Claire arrived at 6:30. Dale had mowed the lawn despite the cold and was proud of it. Ruth came by briefly to return a casserole dish and stayed for 20 minutes because she could not help herself. The wine Michael brought was very good, which Dale noticed and appreciated. The risotto was exactly right. They sat at the table Marta had sat at for 27 years, and ate dinner, and talked about the wedding, and Dale's retirement plans, and a book Claire had been reading, and the dog Ruth was considering getting. The conversation moved through the evening, the way good conversation does, without effort, without agenda, picking up threads and setting them down and returning to them. Marta watched Michael Reardon across the table. He had the focused attentiveness of someone who had been trained to listen carefully and remember accurately. He noticed things. When she refilled his water glass, he thanked her by name, not as a formality, but as a person acknowledging another person. When Dale told a story about a work incident that went on too long, Michael laughed at exactly the right moment, genuinely, without performing patience. He was precisely as good a person as she had assessed him to be. And he had no idea. After dinner, while Dale and Michael were discussing something about college football in the living room, and Claire was helping Marta in the kitchen, Claire stopped drying a plate and looked at her mother. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You seem a little, I don't know, elsewhere." Marta turned from the sink, looked at her daughter, thought about all the things she could say, all the things she would eventually have to say, and the distance between now and eventually. "I'm just happy," she said. "I'm very happy for you." Claire smiled. "You're sure that's all?" "Yes." This was, Marta reflected, the most precisely true lie she had ever told. 3 weeks later, 2 men were arrested in a parking garage in Columbus. They were not American citizens. They did not have documentation that fully explained their presence in the country. One of them was carrying a phone that contained, among other things, the number Marta had called from the payphone outside the laundromat. Hartwell called her at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning. "The network is compromised," she said. "The storage unit has been processed. The digital materials have been traced to their origin, which is what we needed." A pause. "You did well." "What happens now?" Marta asked. It was the same question she had asked in the diner in Hendricks. "Now we have a conversation, you and your legal representation, and us. About what I am. About what happens to people in your situation, under current statutes and precedents. It's not a simple conversation. I know. There are complicating factors, the length of your cooperation, your willingness to assist, your family situation. Are those factors that work in my favor or against me?" "In your favor," Hartwell said, "significantly." Marta stood at the window above her kitchen sink, looking at her rose garden. The bushes were bare now, the winter having stripped them down to their essential shapes. But she could see on the nearest cane a small bud just beginning, barely there, green and tight and impossibly determined. "My husband," she said. A beat. "That's going to be a hard conversation." "Yes." "Do you want assistance with it? A counselor or—" "No." She paused. "I need to do that myself." "When?" She looked at the bud on the rose cane, thought about spring, about what happens when the hard shell of winter finally concedes. "Tonight," she said. Dale was reading his Waterways book when she came into the living room. He looked up, saw her face, and put the book down with the deliberate care of a man who understood that some moments required his full attention. She sat across from him, not beside him because she needed to see his face completely. She needed to watch him hear what she was about to say. She told him everything. She started in 1982, in the library, the man in the grey coat. She moved through the training, the fabricated identity, the Volvo and the teaching certificate, and the social security card. She told him that Marta Voss did not exist before 1991, that the woman sitting across from him had been born 31 years ago in Leningrad with a different name and a different face in her government file, and a mission that had been waiting in her mailbox. She told him about the receipt, the phone call, the storage unit, Hartwell. She told him about Claire and Michael and the dinner and the risotto, and how she had managed all of it while sitting across the table from the two of them, because she had been trained to manage exactly this kind of sustained performance. She told him she was sorry. Then she stopped talking and watched Dale. He was very still. His hands were resting on his knees with the fingers slightly curled, the same posture she had watched him sleep in 100 times. His face had gone through several things while she talked, expressions she could name and others she couldn't, and had arrived somewhere she didn't fully recognize. Not anger, not the shock she had expected. Something more complex than either. He sat there for a very long time. Then he said quietly, "The spider." She looked at him. "You always got the spiders," he said. "I told myself it was because you weren't afraid of them. But I think what it was," he paused, searching for the word, "is that you saw them before I did. Every time." Marta felt something crack open in her chest, not painfully, more like the way ice breaks in spring, the pressure releasing, the water moving again. "I always saw them first," she agreed, "because you were trained to notice things." "Yes." He looked at his hands. 31 years. "Yes. And the whole time," she said, "I was also here, completely here. I know that's—" She stopped, tried again. "I know there's no way to ask you to understand that those two things can be true at once, but they were. They are." He looked at her. His face was doing that thing she didn't recognize, and she realized slowly that what she was seeing was a man trying to reorganize the last 31 years of his life around a truth that had no neat shape to fit into. "Claire doesn't know," he said. "Not yet." "You're going to tell her?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. "Are they going to take you away?" The question was so simply put, so stripped of everything except the essential fear underneath it, that she had to breathe carefully before answering. "I don't know," she said. "There are conversations to be had. There are things that matter in those conversations. What I did, what I didn't do, what I chose when the moment came." She paused. "I chose you. I chose Claire. That's the truth of what I am. Whatever else is also true." Dale was quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. The house settled around them, all its familiar sounds, the creak in the hallway floorboard, the particular knock the radiator made when the heat came on. "Natasha," he said. She looked at him sharply. "Is that still your name? Or is it—" "It was my name," she said. "I'm not sure it is anymore." He nodded slowly, picked up his book, set it down again, looked at her with the expression of a man who is trying to understand an equation that has too many variables. "I need some time," he said. "I know. I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm just saying I need time to think." "I know." She stood, moved to the door, stopped. "Dale." He looked up. "I have loved this life," she said, "everything in it. Even the parts I didn't expect to love. Even the parts that weren't supposed to be real. They became real. That's the truest thing I know how to tell you." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I know." She went upstairs. Below her she heard him pick up his book. She heard the particular sound of a page turning, and then another. She lay in the dark of their bedroom and listened to the house around her, and thought about the things that had survived 31 years of fabrication to become, against all protocol and probability, entirely true. She told Claire on a Sunday in March. The weather had turned tentative, hovering between winter and spring in the way of Ohio marches, cold mornings softening by afternoon into something that felt like a promise not quite made. Marta had asked Claire to come alone, without Michael, and Claire had arrived with the particular alertness of someone who suspects the conversation they are about to have will be significant. They sat in the kitchen. Marta made tea, which she did not drink. Claire wrapped her hands around her mug and waited. Marta told it differently this time. She started not in 1982, not with the man in the grey coat, but with Claire herself. With the particular way Claire had been born, the exact weight of her in those first moments, 7 pounds 4 ounces, with a furious red face and a grip that had fastened on Marta's finger with the absolute conviction of someone who had already decided the world owed them certainty. She told Claire about her first word, which had been no, appropriately enough. Her first day of school, where she had walked through the door without looking back, as if the decision to be brave was already made and there was nothing left to negotiate. Her first heartbreak at 15, when she had come home and climbed into bed, and Marta had sat beside her, and they had not talked, just sat, because Claire had somehow always known when she needed words, and when she needed presence. She told Claire she was the most real thing she had ever made, then she told her everything else. Claire did not interrupt. She was very still, in the way she had been still since childhood, when something required her complete attention, the same focused quiet she brought to a difficult moment with a patient, the absorption of someone who had trained herself to hear past the surface of what was being said. When Marta finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Claire set down her mug, looked at her hands, looked up. "The whole time," she said. "Yes. Everything. The yoga class and the roses and the thing with the pie at Christmas and—" She stopped. "Everything. Yes. But also—" She paused. "But also everything." Marta looked at her. "Yes." Claire stood up, walked to the window, looked at the garden, the bare rose canes, the beginning of something green at their tips. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned around. Her eyes were bright, but her voice was steady. "When I was 7, she said, I was sick, really sick. That flu that went around school. 104 temperature for 3 days. I remember you sitting beside me the whole time. You would put a cold cloth on my forehead and sing something quietly. I don't know what the song was. I don't think it was a song I recognized, but it was the safest I ever felt." Marta remembered. She remembered the song. It was a Russian lullaby she had learned as a child in Leningrad. She had not thought about it before singing it. It had come without invitation. "Was that you?" Claire asked. "The person sitting with me, singing that song. Was that you, or was that—" "That was me," Marta said. "That has always been me." Claire looked at her for a long time. Her face was doing the same complicated thing Dale's had done, the reorganization of years into new shapes, but underneath it, something that Marta recognized. "I have a lot of questions," Claire said. "I know. A lot. I know. And I'm—" She stopped. "I don't know what I am right now. I'm not okay with this. It's going to take a long time to even understand what okay looks like from here. I know. But—" Claire looked at her. "But I know who was sitting beside me when I had a fever, and I know who taught me to drive, and I know who called me every Sunday for 4 years when I was in nursing school, even when I was terrible at calling back. And I know who the person is who taught me that you love people by showing up and staying." She paused. "I know who that person is." Marta could not speak. Claire crossed the kitchen, stood in front of her, did not immediately embrace her, just stood very close, looking at her mother's face with the focused attention she had given this her whole life. "You're still my mom," she said. "I'm going to need time to figure out what else you are. But you're still my mom." Marta reached out. Claire let her hold her. They stood in the kitchen, in the tentative March light for a long time, saying nothing, which was sometimes the most honest conversation available. The legal proceedings that followed were not simple. They were also not, ultimately, as devastating as they could have been. The FBI's counterintelligence unit had been pursuing Rook's Nest for over 2 decades. Marta's cooperation had produced the most significant breakthrough the investigation had seen. The legal framework applied to long-term assets who self-identified and cooperated was different from that applied to active operatives. There were precedents, carefully applied. There were conversations, long ones. Her attorney, a woman from Columbus who specialized in national security law and who had a manner that suggested she had seen most things and was not easily rattled, walked Marta through the proceedings with steady precision. Hartwell testified to the value and extent of the cooperation. The judge who presided over the closed hearing was someone who had spent 30 years looking at the gray areas of human behavior and had developed a capacity for nuance that the law required but rarely made easy. Marta was not imprisoned. She was placed under supervised release conditions with restrictions on travel and communication that would be reviewed annually. She was required to complete an extended debriefing process that took 14 months. She was required to surrender her teaching certificate, which was issued under a name that did not legally belong to her. She was permitted to apply for legal status under her operational name. The name she had built a life around, a process that took 2 years and produced at the end of it a document that said what she had felt was true for the last 3 decades. That Marta Voss existed. The immigration question was more complicated. She navigated it with the help of her attorney and Hartwell, and the particular leniency afforded to someone who had been, in the end, more useful as a cooperating witness than as a prosecutable defendant. She was not deported. She remained in Millhaven, in the house on Elm Street, while the proceedings unfolded around her like weather she was learning to read in a new language. Dale stayed. This was not a foregone conclusion, and Marta did not allow herself to assume it would be. The months immediately following her disclosure were the hardest of their life together. The kind of hard that has no precedent and no roadmap, where 2 people have to find their way through terrain that neither of them has any reference for. There were days when Dale was very quiet, and days when he was very loud, and days when he read his Waterways book, with a focus that suggested he was using it as a shelter from something he wasn't ready to approach. There were also days when he sat beside her in the garden, while she pruned the roses and talked about nothing in particular, and she understood that this, too, was a form of working through it. The sitting, the staying. He had a conversation with a therapist, which he had never done before in his life, and which he described afterward as being like having a tooth pulled, unpleasant and relieving in equal measure. He had several conversations with Claire. He had eventually a conversation with Michael Reardon, who handled it with a professionalism that impressed even Marta, and who told Dale that the work his team was doing with the information retrieved from the Columbus network would, in their estimate, protect infrastructure serving approximately 80,000 people. 80,000, Dale repeated when Michael left. He sat quietly for a while. That's a lot of people. Yes, Marta said, because you called them, instead of, yes. He nodded, picked up his book, set it down, looked at her. Were you ever going to tell me? He asked. Before all this. If it had never happened. If the receipt had never come. Were you ever going to? She thought about it honestly, the way she had learned at some point in the last year to think about things. Not with the trained precision of someone managing a story, but with the less tidy effort of someone trying to find what was actually true. I don't know, she said. I think I wanted to. I think some part of me has wanted to for a very long time, but wanting to do something and doing it are very different. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I think I knew something, he said slowly. Not what, but something. The way you sometimes... He paused, searching for the word, assessed things, rooms, people, even just the way you walked into a new place. There was always this moment where you just took it all in, very quickly, and I always thought it was just how you were. It was how I was trained. But it was also just how you were, he said. By the time I noticed it, it was just Marta. She looked at him. He looked at her. The long, particularized knowledge of 25 years of marriage moving between them like a language they had invented without deciding to. Yes, she said. By then, it was just Marta. He reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically. The way he had 1,000 times, the specific, unhurried gesture of someone who had been reaching for the same hand for decades and found the same hand waiting. They sat in the garden in the late afternoon light, the roses beginning their slow spring return, and said nothing for a while, which was sometimes the most honest thing available. The Smithsonian's International Espionage exhibit opened the following October. Marta did not attend. She was still under the travel restrictions of her release conditions, and Washington was outside their permitted range. But Hartwell sent her a photograph. In the exhibit's Cold War section, behind a glass case, was a small display. A black-and-white photograph, clearly decades old, of a young woman standing in what appeared to be a training facility, looking slightly to the left of the camera. Beside it, a printed card. The card read, "Rook's Nest Program, Soviet Union, 1989-1991. One of the KGB's most sophisticated long-term infiltration operations, deploying trained assets into ordinary American communities with instructions to integrate fully and await activation." The program was partially disrupted by a cooperating asset in 2022, following 31 years of dormancy. This cooperation prevented significant damage to civilian infrastructure and led to the identification of active network members. And then, below it, a single additional line. The identity of the cooperating asset remains protected. Hartwell had written on the back of the photograph, in handwriting that was small and precise, "Thought you should know it's there. You don't have to be named to be real." Marta put the photograph in the kitchen drawer where she kept things that mattered. Birthday cards and Claire's school photographs, and a ticket stub from the one time she and Dale had gone to a concert in Columbus and stood outside for 2 hours in the rain because neither of them had realized you needed to buy tickets in advance. She kept it there, among the evidence of the life she had built, which was the only life she had, which was, she had decided, entirely enough. On a Sunday in April, 18 months after the receipt arrived in her mailbox, Marta was in the garden when Ruth came out onto her porch with 2 cups of coffee. "Come sit," Ruth said. Marta pulled off her gardening gloves, the yellow sunflower ones, still good despite 3 more seasons of use. She crossed the yard and climbed Ruth's porch steps and sat in the chair that had been hers by habit for 19 years. Ruth had been told a version of things, not the full version. The full version was complicated and required security clearances and a legal framework that Ruth did not have and did not need. The version Ruth had been told was that Marta had been involved in something complicated, years ago, that had caught up with her, and that it had been resolved, and that Marta was still Marta if anyone wanted to know. Ruth had said, "I already knew you were complicated." Then she had invited her for coffee, and the subject had not been raised again. They sat on the porch. The morning was soft, the particular softness of April in Ohio, when winter finally concedes and the light comes back at a different angle, warmer and more certain. Ruth's tabby cat occupied the railing with the sovereign authority of a creature that had never doubted its right to exist exactly where it was. "Your roses are coming in beautifully," Ruth said. Marta looked at her garden. The bushes were thick with new growth, deep green and reaching. The first buds were beginning, still closed, their color hidden, but the shape of them already promising. "They had a good winter," she said. "Don't they always? The hard ones are the ones that come back strongest." Marta looked at her. Ruth was watching the garden with the uncomplicated appreciation of someone who had earned, through 7 decades of ordinary life, the right to find beauty in simple things without irony. "Ruth," Marta said, "The card you put in those gardening gloves 3 Christmases ago." Ruth glanced at her. "The sunflower ones?" "Yes. You wrote, 'To the best neighbor I've ever had.'" Ruth smiled. "You are. I've been meaning to say something about that for 3 years." "Then say it." Marta looked at the roses, at the morning light, at the cat, indifferent and certain on its railing. She thought about the long, strange, improbable journey between a university library in Leningrad in 1982 and this porch, these 2 cups of coffee, this particular soft April morning. "Thank you," she said, "for meaning it." Ruth looked at her with the direct, unsentimental warmth of a woman who has known too much of the world to waste time on anything that isn't true. "I always mean what I write," she said. They drank their coffee. The morning continued around them. Somewhere down the street, a child's bicycle went past, the wheels making that particular sound against blacktop that carried, for no reason Marta could name, a feeling of something perfectly placed. She would call Claire later. She and Michael were coming for dinner Sunday, which was today, which meant she needed to check whether she had enough cream for the risotto and whether Dale had remembered to pick up the wine he said he would get. She would need to start the stock by noon. She sat on Ruth's porch in the April light and thought about none of these things and all of them at once. The way you think when you are completely inside your own life and nowhere else. The roses were almost open. She would go back to them soon. Later that evening, after dinner, after Michael and Claire left with the particular reluctance of people who are happy where they are and not quite ready to stop being there, after Dale washed the dishes while Marta dried them with the comfortable synchronized inefficiency of 2 people who have done this 10,000 times, after the kitchen was clean and the lights were lower and the house had settled into its late evening quiet, Marta stood at the window above the sink and looked out at the dark garden. She could not see the roses in the dark, but she knew they were there. She thought about the young woman in the photograph, the one at the Smithsonian behind the glass case, looking slightly to the left of the camera with an expression that was, she knew now, not composure. It was anticipation, the held stillness of someone waiting for their real life to begin. She had not known, standing in that corridor in 1989, that her real life would begin in Millhaven, Ohio, in a house on Elm Street, beside a man who read books about waterways and a daughter who gripped your finger with the absolute conviction of someone who had already decided the world owed them certainty. She had not known, but here it was. Dale came to stand beside her. He looked out at the dark garden too. "Risotto is good," he said. "I know. Michael thinks so too. He said so 3 times. He did." "He's good for her," Dale said. "Yes." They stood at the window together for a while. The dark garden, the quiet street, the ordinary, irreplaceable evening of their life. "Marta," Dale said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her, she realized, from the beginning, with the patient, steady attention of a man who had chosen her and gone on choosing her across 25 years and one very significant revelation, and was, apparently, still choosing. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" He was quiet for a moment. "About the spiders," he said finally. "The ones you always got before I saw them." She waited. "I think," he said carefully, "that the reason I married you, one of the reasons, the first reason I couldn't name at the time, was that you saw things I didn't. You always noticed what I missed. I thought it was just—" He paused. "I thought it was just you." "It was. I know." He looked out at the dark garden again. "I know it was you." The house was very quiet around them. The clock on the mantelpiece, the radiator's particular knock. The creak in the hallway floorboard that meant someone had stepped on the 3rd board from the left. But there was no one in the hallway. Just the house breathing. "I don't know what to do with all of it," Dale said. "I probably won't ever know completely, but I know that the life in this house was real. Whatever else is true, that part is not complicated." She looked at him. This man who had loved her without knowing her completely, and was still here having discovered there was more to know than he'd imagined, standing beside her at the kitchen window in the dark, talking about spiders. "No," she said. "That part is not complicated." He nodded, turned from the window, went back to his chair and his book. Marta stayed at the window a little longer. The dark garden, the invisible roses, there even when she couldn't see them. She pressed her palm flat against the cool glass, felt the solid resistance of it, the realness of surfaces, the particular sensation of being exactly where you are, which is sometimes the most extraordinary thing available. Then she turned off the kitchen light, went to sit beside her husband. Outside in the dark Ohio night, the roses waited for morning, as they always had, as they always would.